We move immediately to questions, leaders' questions under Standing Order 36, and I call Deputy Mary Lou MacDonald, please.
Across the state, there are tens of thousands of homeowners and tenants living in homes built during the Celtic Tiger era with serious building defects. Typically, these homes have no fire-stopping measures, causing significant fire safety concerns. And at the most extreme, they have no adequate fire escapes. Many properties have water ingress, that is, moisture seeping into the structure of the building, slowly eroding the fabric of the home over time. People have to deal with damp and mould, and over the long term, their homes will crumble apart. Other homes have issues with car parks, with cladding, communal doors and lifts. Taoiseach, these homeowners bought their homes in good faith. They paid their hard cash for their home. Tenants, both social and private, rental, pay their rent on time, and yet they find themselves living in unsafe, insecure, defective homes. They did nothing wrong. Those responsible are, in the first instance, the builders and developers who ignored basic fire safety and building standards. But the state also has a responsibility, because light touch regulation and a lack of independent local authority inspection allowed this to happen. And yet, to date, homeowners have been left footing the bill for dodgy building and weak regulation. When they retired, Gary and Lorraine Carew bought their dream home in Bree na Shunna in Ennis. They look forward to their life free from debt after decades of hard work. But after they moved in, defects were discovered, and they now face bills running into tens of thousands of euro in their retirement. In my own constituency, there are hundreds of apartments in the Ivy Exchange on Parnell Street where homeowners face bills of anything up to 80,000 euros for defects for which they bear no responsibility. Sam and Odette Doran live in an apartment in City West. They bought this during the Celtic Tiger. A hard-working couple, they were sold the dream of a secure home ownership in one of our city's new suburbs. Today, they face a bill of up to 40,000 euros to fix defects that they did not cause. And they, like their neighbours, like so many other families, simply don't have that kind of money. And Taoiseach, to add insult to injury, on discovery of these defects in City West, the insurance company for the apartments pushed up the premiums year on year from 30,000 euros to a staggering 190,000 euros per year, with homeowners left to foot that bill, on the hook for that. And the insurance company now threatens to walk away completely. A really frightening prospect. Sam and Odette, Lorraine and Gary and all of the others are part of the 100% Not Our Fault campaign, and along with the Construction Defects Alliance, they've been campaigning for redress now for years. They're protesting outside the Dáil today. So Cahi an Rialtas, a Galtanas, a Salahar Dov Shuad, a Will Coney Urhu, a Diha, a Will Luchtana, a Tiger, a Kelty Urhu. Near Kiart, Egnadini Shabilla, na Forvori, August Druk Rialu, a Iak Taoiseach. Last year, government finally agreed to put in place a defects redress scheme. On January the 18th of this year, Minister Darragh O'Brien met with the families and he promised them two things. Emergency funding for essential fire safety and other works available this year, and legislation underpinning the redress scheme to be published before the end of this year. Now we're here at Taoiseach, we've 5 weeks left in the Dáil calendar, and there has been no emergency funding, no legislation has been published. So when will that funding be available? When will we see the legislation? And when will the full redress scheme be open for applications?
Thank you. Taoiseach, please.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Deputy, for raising this really important issue, which I know affects tens of thousands of people around the country, in my constituency and in yours. And as I've disclosed previously, I'm personally affected, as are other members of the Cabinet. And we appreciate that government intervention is required here. In some cases, people are able to pay the levy. In other cases, they're not. But very often in multi-unit developments, because some people aren't able to pay, the work then doesn't get done. And that's creating huge difficulties for people. And of course, the cost of this work is increasing all the time. And there are insurance implications as well, which you mentioned in your contribution. So there is a commitment from government, which we will stand over, to help in the very short term with emergency works required for fire safety, and then in the near term to help people with the cost of these repairs. And there will be retrospection, because we don't want to discourage people from getting the work done and making the payments where they can. Minister Bryan has been working to progress the various programmes of work that are required to put in place this scheme on a statutory footing. This includes the remediation of fire safety, structural safety and water ingress defects in purpose-built apartments buildings, including duplexes constructed between 1991 and 2013. It was always anticipated that the scheme would take time to develop, and we've always sought to convey that message. It is expected the draft legislation will be published in early 2024. Subject to the legislative process, the scheme will be in place shortly thereafter. While Minister Bryan is working on the legislation as a matter of priority, sufficient time is required to draft the legislation to ensure that the scheme is fit for purpose, provides value for taxpayers and contains appropriate oversight and governance measures. We're committed to helping affected homeowners to get their homes and lives back together. This will require a robust scheme, and it will take a period of time to bring forward the required legislation to underpin it. The scale of defects in apartments and duplexes is significant. It's estimated that of apartments and duplexes or associated common areas constructed between 1991 and 2013, the number that may be affected by one or more fire safety, structural safety or water ingress defects is likely to range between 50 and 80%. That equates to between 60,000 and 100,000 apartments and duplexes. It's estimated that the average cost will be around €25,000 per unit, which means a potential cost to the Exchequer of 1.5 to 2.5 billion. So this is a really significant piece of work that we have to do, much greater than would have been the case, for example, with pyrite, and we are working on it as a matter of priority.
I can agree that the scale of this is absolutely huge. I hope we can also agree that along with builders and developers, the state bears very considerable responsibility for this fiasco. Let's just remember, we talk about defects. We have families living in homes that are not safe, that do not have adequate fire safety protection. In the worst case scenarios, with inadequate fire escapes. That is terrifying. So there can be no excuse for delays with the emergency funding. Minister O'Brien would want to get the finger out now. He met these families in January. We are now in November. That's not acceptable, Taoiseach, to leave people in this scenario on the hook for huge, crippling sums of money, but also with the real anxiety and fear that that brings for families. So I would like a specific date from you, Taoiseach, for the emergency funding. And likewise with the legislation. This has drifted and drifted. We know that the liability here is very, very large, but we also know where culpability lies. And I hope we can all agree as a Dáil that hard-working families and homeowners and renters cannot be left in this desperate situation any longer.
Thank you, Deputy Taoiseach.
Thanks, Deputy. I think we can all agree that there are a number of entities that bear responsibility for this, builders in some cases, other professionals involved in the construction business, and also the state has a degree of responsibility as well, particularly pre-2014, when building regulations weren't what they are now and weren't enforced in the way that they are now. And like I say, ultimately, while the state will pick up the bill for almost all of this work, the cost falls back on the taxpayer, on the people, inevitably, and that's what happens in these scenarios, and that's unfortunately where we are. Just in relation to fire safety, Minister Bryan is working with the Housing Agency on advice and guidance, so owners' management companies can take when carrying out such fire safety works. This includes funding mechanisms for interim fire safety measures in extreme cases, and he will publish further details of this in the coming weeks.
Thank you, Taoiseach. The Leader of the Labour Party, Deputy Ivana Bacik.
Curram dar dish mahori dar shanhish mahori on will Einrod nis tovachti. Taoiseach, Irish society knows well the value of caring for older people in our society, the value of community, the right of everyone to live with dignity. But those values are simply not reflected in your government's policies and actions on home care. And that was evident from this morning's debate on our Labour motion on supports in the home care sector. We know that there are 6,000 people approximately across the country stuck on a waiting list for home support having been assessed, Taoiseach. And that's no way to reward older people who've contributed to Irish society and to our economy over their whole lives. They deserve care and support to live a happy and fulfilled life in their own homes, because the state is supposed to care for its citizens. But we know the state is failing those who are denied access to care in their own homes, and many of us know people who are in that position. Those who are trapped in acute hospitals for over a year at a time with delayed discharges, as revealed by Deputy Kelly just now. And this is due to the avoidable recruitment and retention crisis in the home care sector. And we would have expected, Taoiseach, to see drastic action, radical action from you in Budget 2024 to tackle this crisis, particularly with an ageing population and overcrowded hospitals. But that's not the path you chose with your health budget. Instead, you've frozen recruitment extraordinarily. And yet some of the most important work in the country is provided by the unsung heroes, as Deputy Smith has said, those who work in the home care sector providing care in people's homes. And these workers are mostly women, and they're among the most undervalued professionals in our society, particularly undervalued when it comes to pay and conditions. Now, this year, under pressure, the hourly pay for healthcare support assistants in the private sector was increased. That's welcome, but that move was funded by quietly cutting home support hours by 1.9 million hours this year. We might call that robbing Peter to pay Paul, or more appropriately, robbing Patricia to pay Paula, because these are mostly women. And yet there's no plan to ensure a living wage for these workers into the future, and no plan to ensure that the system will work for those who need care. And it's simply not working, because when an older person can't be discharged from hospital, when an older person can't access care at home, health outcomes are affected. And it's fundamentally unfair to older people, to their friends and to their family. And so often, Taoiseach, I hear from people, again mostly women, hit with the double whammy of caring for their children and their ageing parents too, often while holding down a full-time job. These are women who are struggling, who are panicking, and who do not know how to keep the plate spinning. And as long as the state services are not there, they will have no option but to keep them spinning. And that's why we brought our Labour motion this morning, Taoiseach, calling on you in government to make real reforms to the home care service system, to ensure that we will be able to cater for an ageing population and a workforce struggling with the ever-increasing cost of living. So, Taoiseach, instead of pressing your whitewashing amendment to a vote this evening, will you accept our Labour motion and work with us and across the House to pay Ireland's heroic home care workers their worth, to reverse the ridiculous embargo on recruitment, and ensure that Ireland becomes a place where care is genuinely valued and where older persons can receive the care they so desperately need in their own homes.
Taoiseach, please.
I just want to thank Deputy Bacik for raising this important issue, and I think we can all agree on all sides of the House how valuable home care is. Most importantly, providing older people or even younger people who need care with the dignity that they deserve in life, but also crucially enabling people to get out of hospital quicker, freeing up beds for patients who need them, and enabling people to avoid going into nursing home. And the length of time people spend in nursing home has gone down considerably in recent years, precisely because home support has improved and people can stay at home for longer. The overall budget for home support this year is 723 million. And that's an increase of 228 million since this government came to office. So nearly a 40% increase in funding for home care just under this government. Far from being cut, the number of hours we'll fund next year is 22 million, and that's up from 21.5 million this year. And the amount that's ring-fenced for dementia will increase from 5% in 2021 to 18% in 2024. A new and improved HC support tender for private and voluntary providers has been in place since August, and it is bringing about significant reform in the sector. An increased hourly rate is in place to ensure that home support workers are paid appropriately, and to help deal with some of the issues affecting the waiting lists and recruitment and retention. This includes a new payment rate for travel time, requiring private and voluntary providers to pay the national living wage at a minimum, and also reforming the legacy rate. In terms of the number of people waiting on home care, the figure was 9,000 in 2020 when the government came to office, and at the moment it's below 6,000.
Crucial issues, and can I spell them out? The crucial issues that are evidenced in your own government's figures and the figures from the HSE. The crucial issues are, first, the lack of healthcare workers. There's simply not enough healthcare workers to meet the need there. Secondly, the number of people who are awaiting care, who have been assessed for home care supports and who simply can't access it because of the lack of workers. And thirdly, poor pay and conditions across the healthcare sector, notwithstanding that new tender. Your own ministers Butler and Rabbitte, in response to our motion earlier today, said what we all know to be the case, which is that we can't be sure that that new rate of €13.10 per hour, basic though it is, we can't even be sure that that is being passed on in the private sector. The truth is, Taoiseach, we've seen a creeping privatisation of home care services, and that's having a knock-on effect on recruitment and on retention. It means that we simply don't have enough home care workers, and we simply don't have enough to meet the crucial demand that is there for older persons, persons who are awaiting discharge from hospital, persons who desperately need care in their own homes in order to be able to live with dignity into older age, in a way we all would wish to do, Taoiseach. And you haven't addressed those crucial issues.
Thanks, Deputy. We've never had more people working in our health service or our public service than we have today. And we have in Ireland at the moment full employment, and that's a great thing. But there are downsides to full employment, and one of those is the fact that recruitment and retention is a challenge everywhere: public sector, private sector, urban areas, rural areas, big companies, small companies, very well paid jobs and very poorly paid jobs. It's an across the board issue when you have full employment, and that's a challenge that we face at the moment, but a challenge I'd rather face than unemployment, which of course affected this country for a very, very long time. The new tender rate, which was backdated to July, is a core rate of €31 per hour for providers, which works out at an average rate of €34 per hour, taking into account weekend pay, evening pay and premiums and travel rates. The national living wage is set at €13.10, and there's also travel time between appointments. There is an inbuilt review process in relation to the national living wage after 12 months, and I'm advised that there's no evidence that this isn't being passed on or being paid by providers.
Thank you, Taoiseach. Deputy Paul Murphy, please.
Thanks, Ceann Comhairle. Taoiseach, 12 years ago, I visited the Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza. I was struck by how packed it was. Over 100,000 people living in closely cramped quarters in less than 1.4 square kilometres. Many streets are so small you can't even fit a coffin down them. But today, Taoiseach, much of Jabalia, a refugee camp, lies in ruins because Israel targeted it for bombardment. I visited a hospital in Gaza, Taoiseach. Even then, back in 2011, they were running out of surgical gloves and basic medicines because of Israel's blockade. Today, they are being forced to operate on hospital floors without anaesthetic and are on the verge of running out of fuel. Running out of fuel means the electricity going off and death for people in ICU, for babies in incubators. I met a 12-year-old girl who hadn't seen her father since she was 4 months old. He was one of about 6,000 political prisoners being held by Israel, many without charge or trial, and hundreds of them children. There are now thousands and thousands of children in Gaza who will never see their parents again. Over 4,000 children themselves have been killed. Israel is committing war crimes, Taoiseach, with the support of the US government and much of the EU. They are bombing hospitals and ambulances. They are bombing residential areas with the biggest bombs designed to inflict maximum damage. They are bombing convoys of refugees they ordered to flee south for safety. They're laying siege to 2.3 million people, trying to starve them out by blockading food and water. They're bombing fishing boats to stop people from getting around the siege and feeding themselves. They are committing the crime of genocide, crimes against humanity and war crimes, Articles 6, 7 and 8 of the Rome Statute. They are committing these crimes openly and brazenly, repeatedly declaring their intention to do so in the world's media. Yesterday, the Taoiseach said it may well be the case that war crimes have been committed. That is where the International Criminal Court comes in, but there has to be a proper investigation. Taoiseach, will the Irish government make a referral to the International Criminal Court under Article 14 of the Rome Statute so that there can be such an investigation? Israel is facing growing isolation internationally, Taoiseach. Bolivia has cut all diplomatic ties with Israel. Chile and Colombia have recalled their ambassadors. They were joined yesterday by South Africa and Chad. If Ireland took that step as a European country, if we expelled the Israeli ambassador, it would have an impact globally. It would send a clear signal that when Ursula von der Leyen gave the green light to Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza, she was not speaking for all Europeans. It would further isolate and put pressure on Israel to stop. It would demonstrate real solidarity with the Palestinian people. So 2 questions, Taoiseach. Will the government make a referral to the International Criminal Court so there can be an investigation, and will you expel the Israeli ambassador?
Taoiseach, please.
The position on this has been very clear. There should be a humanitarian ceasefire immediately so that aid can go into Gaza and EU and other citizens can leave. Hamas should free all of the hostages it's holding without any conditions and should lay down its arms because it is a terrorist organisation. And we need a new peace initiative in the Middle East, desperately so. The situation in Gaza is critical. The high number of civilian casualties is deeply shocking, particularly the numbers of children, journalists and also UN and other aid workers who have been killed. The protection of civilians and de-escalation is a priority. A humanitarian ceasefire is required immediately, and the level of aid passing into Gaza needs to be accelerated as a matter of urgency. We continue to engage with EU and regional partners to increase aid allowed into Gaza, and the government is in regular contact with regional foreign ministers and leaders. The Taoiseach has announced 13 million in humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian people, with 10 million for UNRWA and 3 million for UN OCHA. Ireland condemns outright the attack by Hamas and affirms Israel's right to defend itself, but this must be in line with international humanitarian law and in a proportionate manner, and this has not been the case. A distinction has to be made between Hamas and civilians in Gaza, and targeting civilian infrastructure is not acceptable, and collective punishment is a breach of international humanitarian law in our view. De-escalation and protection of civilians must be our first priority. In relation to the role of the International Criminal Court, attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure is a breach of international humanitarian law, as I said. All potential violations of international humanitarian law should be investigated. The prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Karim Khan, confirmed the court has jurisdiction over the situation in occupied territory and by Palestinian nationals outside it, so we don't need to make a referral for an investigation to take place. In relation to the issue of the ambassador deputy, I don't believe it would be the right thing to expel the ambassador from Israel. For exactly the same reasons as we didn't expel the Russian ambassador in relation to Ukraine, we need to be able to engage at some level. There are around 40 Irish citizens being held in Gaza. We want them to be able to leave. Look, Deputy, there's also a young Irish Israeli girl who may well be being held in Gaza as a hostage of Hamas as well. So let's not just be one-sided about this. Our priority, no matter who's holding them, is them being able to get out and get to safety. And that means that we need to be able to engage with the Israeli government and the Israeli ambassador. We also, at some point, want to be able to talk about peace and reconciliation and reconstruction. And that may seem ridiculous now, but we have to keep that hope alive. And while expelling the ambassador might make us feel better for a day or two, it might be a story in the international news for a day or two, it wouldn't actually have an impact on Israel's policy, not for a second. You're a bit naive if you actually think that. It wouldn't cause them to change course. And secondly, it would hamper our efforts to get the hostages out to get the citizens out and also to potentially have some sort of role in future peace building and peacemaking in the area.
Deputy Murphy.
Make sure that she doesn't go back home until all people come home safe.
Deputy Murphy.
Thanks, Ken Corla. Taoiseach, you've acknowledged that there needs to be an investigation by the International Criminal Court. It's true that the prosecutor has said that they have authority. What that's referring to is the fact that Israel is not a signatory to the Statute of Rome, and therefore is saying we're not applicable. And the prosecutor is saying no, things that are committed in Gaza can be covered. But there does need to be a referral in order for a prosecution and investigation to take place. You have the power to make that happen. Will the government make a referral under Article 14 so that there is an investigation by the International Criminal Court? Taoiseach says we can't expel the Israeli ambassador because we need to have diplomatic relations to try and get the Irish citizens out. But Taoiseach, we have those relations right now. We have the Israeli ambassador on the Irish media every day telling lies, covering up for war crimes, and that is not happening. Isn't it true, Taoiseach, that Irish citizens, together with Brazilian citizens, are effectively being held hostage by the Israeli regime in Gaza? That while other countries' citizens have been allowed to leave, the US, Germany, Britain, Irish and Brazilians have not been allowed to leave by Israel.
Thank you.
And that those countries whose citizens are allowed to leave are those who voted in line with Israel against a ceasefire, and that effectively Irish and Brazilian citizens are being punished by Israel for our vote in favour of a ceasefire at the UN. The best thing for Irish citizens in Gaza and everyone else is for the bombing and the assault to stop, and the more pressure on Israel, the more isolation of Israel, the more pressure put on Israel to do precisely that. The best thing we can do precisely is to expel the ambassador and to send a signal to them and to the whole world.
Taoiseach, please.
Deputy, our advice and our understanding is that we don't need to make a referral for an investigation to take place, and the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court has said that they believe jurisdiction applies to the occupied territories, but I'll seek further information and advice on that. There are roughly 8,000 EU and foreign nationals in Gaza. Only a handful have been allowed to leave so far. Only about 20% of EU citizens have been allowed to leave so far, and we've been given no indication that Ireland is somehow being penalised for the stance we're taking in our call for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. But we will not change our position on that, no matter what.
Please.
I was struck by the comments of the new CEO of Tourism Ireland reported in this morning's Irish Times. We have a calculation around revenue per carbon footprint, she said. If we're going to bring someone from the other side of the world, we're going to make sure that we target those who are value added and not those coming in and out leaving a carbon footprint without bringing value. She also discussed capacity constraints at Dublin Airport and in the accommodation sector and said there is still room for growth, but it needs to be responsible growth. Now, Taoiseach, I'd have a number of questions around that. I mean, on the one hand, it seems sort of ideologically neutral, but sometimes the application of something that appears ideologically neutral has a profoundly biased effect. Increasingly, and for a long period of time, we have a concentration of all tourists coming into Dublin and being bused for a day to the Cliffs of Moher and back again. Is there any examination of how sustainable that is? Is there any examination of whether there's a cohort, a very wealthy cohort or a not so wealthy cohort of people who wish to see the west of Ireland, who wish to travel into the west of Ireland and stay in the west of Ireland, so they're not coming into an overcrowded airport, through an overcrowded city, to be driven across the country and back again, perhaps buying a cup of coffee, perhaps not, perhaps going to the toilet, and if they do, that's as much as they do. So is there a tourism strategy that takes account of that? Because if there isn't, I believe any talk about sustainability and sustainable tourism is nonsense, because all it does is sort of say that because there's a shortage of beds in certain parts of the country, that we need to just bring in very wealthy tourists. Is there any consideration of the effect that your government's policy around housing refugees, people seeking asylum and people who are beneficiaries of temporary protection is having on our tourism sector. Because I understand as a stopgap measure, you take whatever is available, but we're all accepting, I think yourself, your government ministers included, that this is no longer a short-term issue. This is a longer-term issue. And 40 to 50% of the hotel beds in Clare are filled with people. I'm not saying they don't need a bed. They clearly do need a bed. But arguably, if they're to integrate into our economy, they need a bed somewhere where they can get a job. And there aren't a load of jobs in Liston-Varna, unfortunately. There are lots of them in Dublin. So what is your government's long-term plan around tourism and sustainability of the tourism sector?
I've always been a huge supporter of the tourism sector and the tourism industry. Got to work very close with them for 3 years as Minister for Transport, Tourism and Sport, and have continued to engage with them and really find people who work in the tourist sector to be among the most hospitable and welcoming people and among the best business people we have in the country. And I'll never forget in that 2011-2012 period after the financial crash that it really was 3 sectors that lifted us out of that recession. It was the multinationals, the agriculture and food sector, and also tourism. And we owe them a debt of gratitude for that. And of course, tourism has the benefit of being able to create jobs all over the country, in the cities and also in rural areas. We are experiencing a climate crisis, though. I think that's obvious to everyone in the country and in the House. And we do have to take account of that, the impact that international travel has on the climate, and indeed internal travel has on the climate. And it has always been the case that we've taken into account not just the raw numbers of people visiting the country, but also the spend. And it wouldn't be a secret to anyone in this House or in the tourist industry that, for example, somebody coming from the US who spends a week in Ireland and travels around the country will be of more economic value than somebody who comes and makes a short weekend visit, for example. So we've always taken into account both the numbers visiting and also the revenue brought in. But people are welcome no matter where they're coming from or how long they stay. In terms of sustainability, we believe busing will become sustainable most quickly. The electric buses and hydrogen buses already exist. They're already being used. They're already being manufactured on the island. So I would anticipate in the next 10 years we'll see bus transfer being very environmentally sustainable. When it comes to aviation, the focus has to be on sustainable aviation fuels. It's early days yet. We want Ireland to be a leader on that. Ireland will always need aviation. We are an island after all. And the focus that we want is a move to sustainable and synthetic aviation fuels so that we can make that sustainable into the future. In terms of tourism policy, Minister Martin is going to publish a new national tourism policy. That will be done in early 2024 and will focus on the environment and also economic sustainability for the sector.
Deputy McNamara.
I find your answer somewhat surprising. On the one hand, you say we need to curb international travel and take account of sustainability. And in the other, you want to lift capacity limits at Dublin Airport. Nowhere have you discussed exploiting capacity at other airports so that people are flown directly into a region that they might stay in, hopefully when there's a greater balance of how people are accommodated, who need accommodation, but nevertheless the state is to match that with what it provides. And instead, you say that it's going to be sustainable. We're going to have electric buses bringing them from Dublin Airport down to the west of Ireland so that they can see Kylemore Abbey or the Cliffs of Moher or whatever it is, and back again. And suddenly that's sustainability. Now, I don't wish to mischaracterise what you said, but that's how I've interpreted it. You might explain, if that's not what you said, what you mean by sustainable tourism and balanced regional tourism in this state going forward.
Thank you, Deputy. Taoiseach.
Thanks, Deputy. I'm happy to clarify that I haven't called for a curb on international travel. Far from it. Far from it. That's not my position whatsoever. I said we do have to take account of it. That some journeys are more valuable to the state than others, and I've given you an example of exactly that. And also we need to make sure that we move towards sustainable aviation fuels, because that is the future. The future for me is not stopping flying, and I don't want to stop flying either, by the way. It's a move towards sustainable aviation fuels and synthetic aviation fuels. That is the future, in my view. But we do need to take account of it, and we also need to consider offsetting as well. And government departments, as you know, do that themselves as a matter of course. The government also has a policy of favouring the regional airports, Cork, Shannon Airport, Ireland West and others. When it comes to Dublin, as you know, we take money off Dublin Airport in the form of dividends and other charges. When it comes to the other airports, we provide funding. We provided considerable funding for Cork recently, also for Ireland West and for Shannon. And it's good to see those airports seeing real passenger growth now. And I'd like to see a lot more of it. But we also need to be honest with people. It is airlines that decide where they fly. And airlines will make decisions more often than not as to whether they fly from Dublin or Manchester, Birmingham or Manchester, or Birmingham or Dublin, rather than Dublin or Shannon or Cork. And that's the reality of that. We need to be honest with people in that regard.
Thank you, Taoiseach. That concludes Leader's questions.